Hello, everybody. We are coming back now for our Science Behind Sours panel. I'll introduce everybody real quick and give you an idea of who they are. And then we can get into discussing sours and cultures and everything fun about beer and what really got us started more in the sour game. So to my right is my head brewer, Rachel Howard. She's been with us a year and a half as head brewer. She's been with us since 4 days after we opened, but Rachel has worked her way up from literally beer tender to head brewer and has a background in chemistry from a local university here and has absolutely killed it for us. Below her is James Howitt. He is owner of Black Project in Colorado and does some amazing wild beers along with some other. Are all your stuff wild and spontaneous fermentation, James?
Yeah.
Sweet. Cool. And then Jeff Mello is to his left. He's the owner of Bootleg Biology in Nashville. Are you guys still in Nashville, right?
Nashville, Tennessee, yep.
Mm-hmm. Sweet. Yep. So we do a lot of work with Jeff and have been close with him since we started our whole sour program. So we're excited to have him on as well. James also, yeah. James, I had your beers for the first time when I was down at GABF a few years ago, and we were all blown away. We have pictures standing in front of your feeders.
Oh, wow. Okay.
From a couple years ago, I think.
Yeah, back there.
Yeah. That's the one right there. Yes.
I'd be a horrible weatherman, apparently. I can't.
It is. Everything's backwards. We figured that out the other day. So, all righty. Well, let's talk sours. Anybody? I mean, I guess getting into it. Tell us. I kind of introduced everybody, but tell us a little bit about what you do and a little bit about what your thought process is behind this. I guess the science take behind the sours. You want to start, Rachel?
Sure. Like you said, my name's Rachel Howard. I've been at Ouzel Finch for over 4 years now and took over head brewer about a year and a half ago. I started learning about sour beers under our former head brewer, Mike, and he started our mixed fermentation barrel program, and we started off doing kettle sours, and then we quickly turned to live sours. So about half of our steel, or actually over half of our steel now, about 3/4 is live sour, and it's on the same floor as our clean steel. And then in our back facility, we have all of our mixed fermentation barrels. We've never done any purely wild fermentation or spontaneous fermentation, but all of our barrels are inoculated with several different strains of PDO and lacto and Brettanomyces, and we actually have our own wild yeast strain that we cultivated from a local museum here on the fort. There was General Butler's dining chest, and we swabbed a bunch of different places on it, came up with a wild yeast strain, and we now have it inoculated in some of our barrels. So we do a lot of kind of the heavily fruited sour beers, but we also have a passion for a lot of the mixed firm stuff as well. So my ultimate goal is to have a cool ship on the roof. We'll see if that ever happens, but I'm working on it.
It will happen, I promise.
Okay.
One day.
All right.
I do want to get, and we will touch more on this later, Rachel, but I definitely want to talk a little bit about the SOPs and stuff that you've put together in order to successfully run a sour and clean program in the same area, which a lot of folks think are impossible. But I think you've proven time and again that it's 100% possible. So that's an interesting conversation to be had. And I do want to come back to the Civil War era dining chest as well later on, but we'll talk about some of those things as we move forward. I'm going to go down to Jeff. And Jeff, tell us a little bit about how you got into creating or capturing cultures. I remember seeing your stuff. I mean, I was still homebrewing, and I saw your little bootleg biology jars on the homebrew shelf, and blew my mind. And then, when we opened the brewery and decided to go sour and started really pursuing that avenue, it was cool to get to know you and, visit your place during CBC in Nashville and meet all the folks that are doing some great things with your cultures. But tell us a little bit about how you got into it and what really makes you geek out over some of this stuff.
I think kind of similar to a lot of people's stories. I was an overly ambitious homebrewer, and I was actually inspired by Mike Tunsmeyer. I think we all have someone who kind of like inspired us. And Mike Tunsmeyer, the Mad Fermentationist, was a member of my local homebrew club when I was living in DC, and he had written an article about kind of finding wild yeast outside, and I was like, yeah, I'm gonna do this. I brewed 3 batches of homebrew. Of course I can do this. But I did find a wild yeast that I ended up calling S. arlingtonensis after Arlington, where I lived. Made a decent batch of beer with it, and I was pretty much hooked from that point. A lot of people will get into brewing, at least on the homebrew side, because there's some aspect of creativity or the food culinary aspect, or they're just like into gadgets. But the mysticism of fermentation and yeast and bacteria, no matter how much I've learned, has always been kind of my guiding force for my interest in beer, any kind of fermentation. And so that's really was the genesis of bootleg biology. Was let's try to find wild yeast. Let's try to teach other people how to find wild yeast. Let's teach them how to use some basic science skills. So you can go onto our website and learn how to make agar plates and isolate yeast. You don't need a degree to do that. You just need some time and attention and some basic materials. And then if I'm going to find wild yeast, why don't we catalog it? And then that's where the local yeast project was born. It was kind of similar to what Ouzelfinch was doing with your guys' wild yeast. Is okay, let's find a yeast with an interesting story or an interesting location. And then collect those stories and then use them for brewing because we all like to drink. But then part of the local yeast project is to make a database that's ongoing of all the wild cultures that we find in the U.S. and around the world. And so that has been what we've wanted to do since day one, is focus on wild cultures, teach other people about using wild cultures, and then just make some really good tasting beer or wine or whatever suits your fancy. And so we're a full-fledged yeast company, so we work with a lot of different breweries on clean cultures, wild cultures, coming up with, I think the most exciting part of what we do is coming up with custom unique blends. We have a knowledge of lots of different yeast and bacteria, and so we get brought problems or new ideas, and I want to guide people in a direction with their brewing based on my knowledge of microbes. And I think, the more brewers know about fermentation, the better, and individual microbes. But this is what we do all day, every day. And so if we can give some kind of insight on the right microbes or how to use them, then you're going to make, hopefully, the best beer you can possibly. And that's part of what gets me excited about working with wild microbes.
Heck yeah. Well, I know that you've helped us make some amazing beer with some of your stuff. And we just redid our house culture, maybe close to a year ago, or not even, maybe 6 months ago, Ray?
Yeah.
And we used, Jeff helped us put that together, and Rachel got to kind of pick, what her strain was gonna be, and help Jeff helped us build that and put it together, and it's been an awesome experience so far. So nice. We'll come back more to that here in a second. I want James introduce yourself, sir, and tell us about what got you into beer, and tell us about what why spontaneous wild ales only.
Yeah, so I went to college for microbiology and used that to teach high school science for 5 years. And I was a pretty avid home brewer, and I was at that point, but by the into that sort of 5-year period, I was getting pretty into wild yeast and a little bit with like home spontaneous fermentation, which is pretty hard to do. But I was harvesting wild yeast from just various places around my house. I mean, like Jeff said, it's not really like a super difficult process, and I had the background in it, so it was pretty straightforward. And then I opened the brewery, and originally we opened as a clean brewery and just made all kinds of beers. And Black Project was sort of a side bottle only venture. And after a year and a half, so by now we opened originally in 2014. By 2016, we decided to only do Black Project in the tap room and everything. So we've been with Black Project longer than we were anything else. But I think the thing that interests me most about spontaneous fermentation is that working with a single or a couple of cultures to me is like ranching. And people often say, you know, a yeast rancher type of deal. But, you know, if you're a rancher, you have to understand that breed of cow or cattle and the requirements that they have. But the interesting thing for me about spontaneous fermentation is you have an almost unknown mixture of organisms, and it's almost impossible to understand their needs as directly as you can when you're working with pure culture. And so it's, to me, instead of yeast ranching, it's like it's almost like being a rainforest ecologist versus like a yeast rancher. You know, you are always trying to influence and stuff like that, but understanding the interplay of different organisms. And that's not to denigrate pure culture beer at all. It's different. You can go very deep in understanding all the intricacies of what you can do with one strain, which I like also. We do, I think about 50% of our brewing is Coolship spontaneous, traditional method type of stuff. But we also do what we call spontaneous Solera. So it was started as spontaneous barrels, and then it's just been growing with Solera method, removing 1% and then adding work to it, which is, I wouldn't really call it spontaneous beer, but the Solera was spontaneous. So we do quite a bit of that, and we do some pure culture, but with environmentally caught native yeast. So we have a couple of strains banked that we use, one of which is from when I was a home brewer, when I was doing that in my kitchen. It's from a crabapple tree across the street from my house. So we still use that occasionally. We're doing a little bit more with it. Usually that's beer on tap because it's a really clean strain, and it's not, people kind of expect sour beer from us. So it's a little bit, it's weird sometimes to make a not sour beer, try to explain that, like, well, it's still wild because it's a native microbe from the environment, but it's not bacteria, so it's not sour. But I like all of that stuff. I think it's really interesting. And overall, I would just say our focus is on native microbes. I mean, our beer's all fermented with stuff from the environment in one way or another. And the only time we use lab yeast is for can conditioning. And that's simply because we don't have bright tanks and we're filling with flat beer. And so we use a champagne strain for that, but it's still a live product. So, yeah.
That's awesome. I want to talk a little bit about James, because I think that's a really important distinction. We're all going to be old and gray, and in our retirement homes, talking about sour beer production, how wild doesn't mean sour. That's never going to not be an issue. But I think it's more of just people like James demonstrating what wild cultures can be, and you guys at Ouzel Finch, demonstrating how you can use wild cultures. And a pure wild yeast makes a beer that could pass as any kind of lab-grown industrial strain, and that's, I think, something that's surprising to a lot of people. And that's something with the local yeast project. I think a lot of people assume that you're just going to make these crazy sour beers, and sour beers are totally part of wild beer making, but they don't have to be the goal. It doesn't have to be how you produce. And I really like how James was talking about, you can have cultures that you source from the wild, but if you use them enough and incorporate them into your process, you kind of have a de facto domestication. We just say kind of like as a house culture, but it sort of becomes endemic to your brewing environment, your brewing process. You can have the same cultures and give them to someone else, and they can't steal your sour beer making because it's not going to be the same. And so I think that's something when we talk about, the traditional lambic brewers, is that those cultures are in some way endemic to those breweries, and so they can have, I think, more power of repeatability in essentially a wild process just because of how they use those microbes and how they kind of are stick around more than just a straight spontaneous fermentation.
Yeah, I mean, that's awesome. Do you when both of you talk about, I know, Jeff, you guys have your own yeast bank and you bank them yourself, or do you guys outsource that?
Oh yeah, we have a bank on site.
Okay, sweet.
Yeah, we have quite a bit. It's not just like our flagship cultures that we sell. We have local yeast projects, which we have 500 plus cultures from that, and then we just have random things that we come across, and we're kind of like scavengers of microbes. Our focus isn't always just on making a specific beer. Sometimes it's there's a cool sourdough culture or something like that, and we'll stick it in the bank, and 5 years from now we'll go, you know what, that actually might be useful in some kind of new application. Part of what we're trying to do is push the envelope on how microbes are used. I think people associate wild fermentation with kind of like a very traditional mindset. And I think if you've had a lot of brewers who like wild fermentation, that they're not necessarily trying to make a traditional beer. That's not necessarily how American sour beers are made all the time. A lot of times it's just, here's my palate, here's what I'm working with, and then I'm going to see how I create a whole new piece of artwork using fermentation and new microbes. And so if we take a bacteria that was from some homemade kimchi and then apply it to a different application, it doesn't mean you've made kimchi. It just means that you've redefined how beer is made or some other kind of fermentation is done in a way that is new and creative. And to me, that's exciting about microbes, is that we get to force them to play in a certain way, and that's how we get to use our creativity and knowledge, and hopefully the science can guide us in how we use those microbes and new ways.
How many? Oh, sorry.
Wasn't one of the I think Jeff probably knows this. One of the like well-known Brett strains that's been, everybody sells it. I think wasn't one of them like found in like a cola factory or something, or?
Oh yeah, I'm trying to think.
I don't know. I feel like one of them is
known from like maybe a Dr. Pepper can or something.
Yeah. It was like had nothing to do with beer, but it's like one of the like 3 or 4 that like is like the real, the ones you could get 10 years ago kind of thing from White Labs. So I don't know.
Yeah, and I think
weird. Yeah,
the assumption that you can only get certain Brett strains from Belgium is it's not necessarily true. Maybe the ones that are endemic to certain lambic breweries, but the microbes don't really care where they are.
Right.
Just give them some sugar and they'll be happy.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's a thing like when I've been in Brussels, I've had many people just who don't know what I do at like lambic bars who'll be like, you can only do this kind of fermentation in Brussels, and I'm like, oh, really? Interesting. You can't make beer, you can't do it that way elsewhere. I'm like, oh, okay. I'm like, I'm not gonna argue with you, but not that it's lambic if you do it somewhere else, but like, I think you can pretty much do, and there's all kinds of, when you really look into it, there's all kinds of spontaneous fermentation going on in different beverages all over, done all different ways, right? So, but it's that's part of their like mythos of the culture of lambic and the Belgian people. And so I don't want to crush their spirit, but
that's to me, and this is just me getting my high horses. Like I think of it the way, lager is produced. Lager is more than just using a lager yeast, and I say that as a lab that's intentionally trying to break lager brewing in some way. We have our clean white culture that we call Oslo, which really upsets people and say, oh, you can make lager-like beer. But I think of lager brewing as the sum of all those parts. It's the process, it's the strain, it's their mash schedules, it's all those things combined. And so when I talk about, lambic as a beer, to me it's all those things. And so yeah, you can't technically make some of those beers outside of Belgium because it's more about who's making it and the process and all those stuff. But man, you can make some really good, similar beers, if you will.
I mean, you're talking about some of these buildings are 120. They've been doing it for 100 years in the same building. They couldn't do it across the street probably the same.
No.
I mean, so you talk about resonant culture. It's not just, the air is part of it, but it's the air of the brewery. And nobody in America has that kind of like resonant culture that some of those places do, where they've done the same thing for 100 years and had barrels there for forever. And yeah, what you can do? Yeah.
One day. Hey James, are you banking all your own stuff, or who do you bank with?
White Labs.
White Labs. Okay, cool, sweet. Yeah, we have some stuff banked in Northern Virginia, and as we continue to expand our program, I'm sure we'll spread out from there as well.
Yeah.
How many cultures do you, or how many microbes, Jeff, do you think you're working with on your side? If you had to send us a list of everything, I mean.
Oh boy. I mean, to be honest, we just have a big old database. So we have thousands, and that's not even counting individual. A lot of times brewers will send us their mixed culture, and they want it just as it is, and so we'll bank a culture as a mixed culture and not even do any kind of isolation work on it, because I think it's actually a bit precarious trying to pull apart all the individual components on some of those mixed cultures, because the complexity is so intense, and there might be some microbes that exist on such a microscopic level that traditional isolation methods might not capture them all. So a lot of times we'll bake it as a mixed culture, and so there's some of these strains or some of these blends, have tons of individual strains in them. So as far as isolated cultures, we have thousands, but it's never going to stop. There's never going to be a point where you're like, okay, we're done. I think that's a great thing about craft brewing is the mindset of like the work is never done, innovation is never done. We're always building on something, whether it's a unique style of beer or process, and so that's kind of the mentality we have, is keep going forward and try to. Sometimes it's not even just getting something new, but thinking about something from the past and using it a different way is just as important. So I think the spirit of innovation is sometimes not even the craziest thing. Sometimes it's just using it in a new way.
Yeah, I agree. And honestly, that's kind of a good segue into pulling Rachel in here and talking more about the yeast strain that she was able to harvest off of the Civil War era artifact. But also we exist, like our brewery is on an old Army fort in Virginia. And so, it's been around for hundreds of years. There's so much history tied to this place, and so one of our goals when we started was not only to spread the love of beer and being able to do something unique that challenges folks' palates, but also to really show an appreciation for the history that kind of lies in our community. And so a few years ago, Rachel was able to get over to the museum and harvest a culture there. And I do know Rachel loves more of the barrel program and has done some pretty cool stuff over there. So Rachel, tell us a little bit about the culture and what you've done with that, and tell us about just your your kind of ethos when it comes to our barrel project and our sour project as a whole.
Okay. So my first start in mixed fermentation was that project that I did, and the cool thing that I thought about it was that the chest had been kept in an oxygen depleted environment for several years. I don't know how many, Russ, do you know?
It was like 60 or 70 years,
Yeah.
since it had been removed. So
yeah, so we were able to go in and remove it for the first time, and swab all these different spots. And we swabbed 24. I had controls for all of the WLN auger that we used, and only one plate came back viable with something on it that wasn't mold or something I couldn't use. So we ended up taking that one little colony on that plate and propping it up over time. And then we brewed it initially into a 7-barrel batch, and it was a super slow fermentation. We didn't really know how it was going to work at first, so different temperatures and pitch rates and all that stuff. And eventually, we got it to the point where we could brew it into a Belgian blonde, and there was no like weird off flavors. It tasted like a Belgian blonde, like something just the same exact yeast you would use for that. So we were able to manipulate it, and we haven't brewed it into any of our steel aged beers, but we've ended up putting it in a ton of our barrels. But for our mixed fermentation kind of philosophy that we have here, it's really just based on blending by taste. I don't really put anything into barrels with a plan in mind. We kind of brew a base Imperial Saison recipe. I pick different strains and inoculate different barrels with either solely Brett or solely bacteria, or there's some that are blends of both of them. And then I pick certain barrels based on time in the barrel, acidity, and then the Brett strain that's in there. And we kind of blend something that has a nice balance of acidity, funk, and body from some of the younger barrels that we have in there. So that's kind of where we're at right now. I'd love to experiment more with different strains, and obviously get more barrels. And I want to do a lot more of like spontaneous cultivation of yeast, and then propping those things up and kind of doing more of a local experiment, kind of like Jeff was saying with his bootleg biology, and how they have their local yeast project. I think there's so many things that we could harvest on the fort, with all of its historical significance, and the fact that it's basically a peninsula, just surrounded by water. There's so much that kind of passes over our area. So just kind of doing some certain projects like that is where my head is at. I don't know if that answers your question.
it did. I was really hoping you'd mention the blending part, because I know that's something you're really passionate about. And I think we have 90 or 100 barrels or so in the barrel program right now, and all of them are either sour or wild barrels, until we got 4 bourbon barrels the other day, which we haven't had in a while. So we'll see what we're going to do with those. But we have some barrels that are Scotch barrels that are wild, some bourbon, whiskey, everything that had first time use with some dark beers in it. And then we ended up throwing some different cultures, some from Jeff, in a bunch of those barrels a year or two ago, and Rachel has continued to keep that going. But it's that was kind of where I was hoping you'd go, is the blending aspect, because I know we haven't talked much about that yet. But James, do you guys do any blending over at Black Project, or are you guys?
Yeah.
I figured you did. How many barrels do you all have?
We probably should call it blendery, but that wasn't cool yet. I think we were slightly before artisan ales, and also way before blendery was cool. So I don't know.
I think your full name is the best, though. Wow.
Artisan blendery of spontaneous and wild ales. That's the new verbal trademark. I'm making the logo today.
Do it.
I want to call bootleg biology a yeast blendery too. I think that's something on that too.
But so I was like, blending. So almost everything we do is blended to some degree. So whether it's blending from different Solera vessels, or especially when we do traditional alembic style stuff, that's all. It essentially has to be blended, I think. I mean, we've had some barrels that are really killer by themselves, but it's almost always the case where the sum is more than the parts. And it's, I mean, kind of like Rachel was saying, like, we don't, it's always by taste. I know people who, some people try to have like a very scientific view of how to do that. And I never have been able to, I'm not a very organized person, but I've never been able to like organize how you would do that. I mean, to me, it just makes sense to, you know, just go by how it tastes. That's what people are going to do, is drink this. Like, I mean, I've had people be like, oh, you should, like, you know, do genetic testing on each barrel and then like combine it based on microbes. I'm like, what does that do? You can't taste that. It could be interesting to know. I mean, it's the same, you know, question of like, have you ever had, you know, testing done on like what comes out of the Coolship or whatever? We haven't, because I don't know what I would do with it. To me, I can alter the recipe. You know, if we're getting a little too sour, or we're this or that, or we're changing the grain bill, maybe we get a new batch of hops, and so we're increasing the amount to increase IBUs. But that's all by flavor and sensory. Whereas, like, knowing, okay, well, you have these strains, it wouldn't change how we do it. And so it's just sort of like, of all the things that I don't really have time to do, that doesn't really, I don't know. It would be neat to know, but it doesn't affect how we would do it. So that's kind of cool. I guess I did have a question kind of for both Rachel and Jeff, because you've both done this. It seems like more than I have. What is your process when you're isolating a wild strain? You've taken it off of a plate, so you have this colony, and I'm assuming you're going to a very small liquid culture. What, I guess how are you vetting like those? So let's say you had 4 or 5 colonies, or different, maybe you've even taken different samples from different places, and you have maybe better success than you did with the Civil War trunk, but like, you know, so you've got multiple samples from different wildflowers or whatever. How are you vetting the small cultures? I mean, sensory wise, or because my experience with wild strains is sometimes people think they're always going to be really funky, and I've gotten a lot of wild strains that I feel like are almost too clean. Like, they go real slow still, but it's almost like I'm not really sure what this is adding, and almost in a way, it has almost like less flavor in some ways than like an ale yeast does, which is strange. But then I was talking to somebody, and they were like, hey, but what about, you know, ale yeast and lager yeast has been selected for flavor also, not just fermentation ability. And so it reasons that some stuff is out there that wasn't selected because it didn't taste as good. I don't know. So how are you vetting small samples before you go to something bigger, if that makes sense?
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Jeff. I've only had experience with, you know, something where I got one culture off of it, so I can't really speak too much to the multiple.
Okay.
It sounds like Rachel, it sounds like your yeast selected you. If there was one.
Yes. It wanted to come home with me, so.
That's awesome.
The microbes are domesticating us, I'm pretty sure. We feed them, and we do their bidding, right? But I think for us, you know, we handle so many microbes, and Rachel was talking about using, I think you use WLN, which is a general purpose media, and it's great because it has Brahmacresol green in it, which is it's a pH indicator, but it also helps differentiate cultures. So it's quite amazing. You can actually identify quite often, at the very least, species and sometimes even individual strains based on how they grow on any media, but specifically WLN is the best I've found. So we often can screen some of these wild samples and go, oh yeah, this is going to be, you know, likely a sac culture or maybe even a lager culture. Bread is very obvious to us. You know, Pichia has a very unique morphology on a plate. So for our purposes, since we deal with so many different cultures, because we have our own wild cultures that we find, and then, you know, we encourage others to send their cultures in. And so since we have a focus on brewing, we're trying to nail down which ones might be the best for beer. And so we usually try to shoot for those ones that are Saccharomyces genus, just out of simplicity and making our lives simpler. But I think things like Lactantia can be pretty easy to spot too, which is the lactic acid producing yeast. So that helps a lot. But then I think, like Rachel was doing, it's like you essentially just have to brew with it. You have to trial it out. The hardest thing is not just a slow fermentation, but a lot of them just don't want to ferment very well. So that's the first hurdle, is getting it to ferment beer worts. It's in some ways a helpful hurdle, because people making wine or other simple sugar type fermentations, it has a wider array of microbes. With beer, there's only certain types of microbes that can really attenuate a beer fully. So that's a great hurdle to have in some ways. And so, attenuation is really the biggest concern. And then, we do it very simply, and we just do a small test batch. We'll just make a large volume of wort, and then half gallon or gallon jugs. We'll pitch individual pure cultures and let it roll. That's the simplest way.
So, James and Jeff, you guys may be able to answer this one a little better with the microbiology background, but I know with Rachel's culture that she pulled off, it kind of morphed in between the first 3 beers we had it in until it settled at where it is. And is that something that you experience often with different yeast cultures, to where you may start off, where the flavor and profile actually changes with every use? Until it kind of hits its happy place, or is that even how would we explain that? Because I know even as it was happening, we were kind of trying to talk through it and figure out why it was a distinct difference the first couple of times we used it. No.
I can at least say that. While they may have similar flavor profiles, they are not domesticated in a way that the strains that we're used to brewing from labs. So yeah, there's some variability that can be found there. And also think of it this way, is that even with a pure culture, every time there's a cell division, you're introducing the possibility of genetic change. And that's often why, the yeast labs, not just, nefariously are trying to take brewers' money, but to encourage a certain amount of repitching and then going back to the bank again, is because you can start seeing variation over time on repitching. But usually with domestic strains, it's a much slower process. So that's definitely a possibility with a wild culture. But also, if you start with one colony, that's not a lot of genetic variation. And when a yeast lab props up your culture from a freezer vial, they're going to start with lots of colonies, because even in a pure culture, if you pick one colony out of 100, you might be selecting for some kind of trait that's just a little bit different from what you were expecting from that normal ale yeast. And that's something that could, over multiple generations, get out of whack or whatever. One variant of that culture starts dominating, and then you start seeing the differences.
Cool.
Yeah, that's all I would say. Is I think you're essentially doing a little bit of artificial selection against a real small starting point, right? And also, I think in that case, you're taking something that was growing on who knows what kind of carbohydrate source originally, and so it seems like to then put it in beer, that suddenly there's like the opportunity for slight differentiation to happen seems higher, because you've given it a very different environment than whatever it was able to do while it was on a piece of wood for a long time,
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Cool. James, I honestly keep thinking this in my head. I got to ask you, where do you put everything? Because last time I was at your place, I didn't see a lot of space, but where's your barrels and everything at?
I'll show you.
Let's do it. Rachel, you can show ours next.
Tour.
What are these guys doing? Oh, it's backwards.
Hi.
You look like an angel.
Hello.
Look at this. What's going on? Wild. Yeah, so we have some foodies over here, but then we have this room in here.
Oh, there's another room.
Everything's backwards, so
It's a
sorry. It's gonna be
secret
really
room.
shaky. So this is our barrel room. So I don't know if you saw this last time, but
I did not. No, that's
yeah.
what
So this is where the barrels are in the cool ship.
It's beautiful.
I don't think that light.
Cool.
They're trying to turn the lights on, but it's anyway. Yeah.
Sweet.
So that's what it's kind of hidden. We got this. We took over part of the space next door quite a few years ago and put the barrels in there. They used to
That's
be
awesome.
They used to be here where the fooders are. We had all of our barrels stacked up, like 30 of them, and now there's 100 and something
Oh
there.
my.
That's awesome. Oh
Yeah.
Is the cool ship? Do you have it inside, or is it up on the roof, or where do you guys have it?
No, so we our first 2 seasons we used. Let me just get my charger. real quick.
Anybody want to fill some
So our first
space?
2 seasons, you can actually
There it is.
see our original cool ship. Where is it? My head's in the
Point.
way. Shit. I'm so bad at this. This side, right there, those 2 stock pots.
Yeah.
They're much bigger up close, but those are each like about a little over 50 gallons. So that was what we used for our first 2 seasons, and we literally just covered them with the nylon mesh and put them on the roof and pumped the wort up there. And then now we have a 12-barrel copper cool ship that we had made locally, and we're actually working on having a new one made now in Belgium for next season, hopefully. So
Cool.
a little bigger and a little bit easier to use. So. But it's inside now, but it's under a window with a screen. So we open the window and it's directly under it.
So you kind of bring up a point that I think would be cool to touch on that a lot of homebrewers probably don't understand when it comes to the spontaneous cool ship. Define and talk about when you say season, what that means.
Yeah. So traditionally, lambic style beer is only made in the colder months. So we actually use the cool ship close to year round, but we will be doing smaller batches and it's going into a Solera vessel. So I think a lot of the issue with brewing these beers in the summer is the cooling rate is not as quick. And so you have a little bit more growth of probably enteric bacteria. But to me, it's never been an issue for us when we're taking that wort and then putting it into 3 times its own volume of finished live beer. So it ferments very quickly that way, and we're adding to that culture in that vessel, but we're not expecting the small number of microbes in it to finish the beer. But that's what we do in the winter time. So yeah.
What's the optimal temperature that you kind of? I know you said you do it year round, but what's your optimal temp to where you would consider it in season, basically?
I mean, so for us, for the lambic stuff, we do it all winter. We generally look for it to be about 40 degrees as a low at night. But I mean, to me, again, it comes back to blending. And so it's always about like, if it is a little bit weird in the end of the season or the beginning of the season, that becomes part of blending. And we've never had an issue where we're like, oh, wow, the barrels that we end up doing in April or whatever are never good. It's never really been a problem as far as like consistently dumping barrels from late in the year. But like I said, by the time it starts to get into the like low of like the 50s or even 60s, at that point we are transitioning to just brewing Solera beers through the summer. And so it's a little bit different process for sure in that, it comes out of the cool ship and goes into finished live beer. So it ferments very quickly. It's not a low pitch rate. It's in fact probably quite a high pitch rate, so to speak. So it's very different than the traditional lambic stuff, lambic style. Yeah. So
have you guys seen the oak cool ship that I think it's Foeder Crafters makes?
No.
It looks
wild.
amazing. They posted it online not too long ago, and I'm already convinced. That
seems like it'd be real
That's what we
sticky.
need. Yeah, I
Seems
mean,
like
yes, but hey,
I don't know how
sticky.
you would clean it.
yeah, I know. Lots
Between
and lots
uses.
of really, really hot water.
yeah, I guess that would do it.
But,
I knew they used to make a stainless one at Foeder Crafters. Like it was like a multi-level deal.
Yeah,
Yeah.
honestly, I saw it pop up probably about 6 or 7 months ago on there, and I don't know who they made it for, but it immediately was just intriguing. So it's an interesting
cool.
take
Yeah.
on it. So, Jeff, we may be sending you some stuff soon-ish. I didn't, we didn't get Rachel a cool ship yet, but I had put together some beehives, and so I've got 2 hives that are active right now that are kind of foraging around the fort, collecting pollen and making honey. And so my goal is to kind of drain those out and see what we get out of it. But it'll be a fun project. But we may be reaching out to you to help us out with that a little bit as well.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, I mean, pollinators are doing the work for us, moving around those microbes, those wild microbes. So we must preserve the bees at all costs.
100%. I didn't know how much I would geek out over bees until I ordered these hives, and I started learning more about what they do and how they do it and how they live and how they function in their own little ecosystem there. And it's just really, really, really interesting. And I don't know. Yeah, I'm stoked about it to see what we can get as a whole to say it really would be like Fort Monroe's or the fort's kind of house culture or whatever. So I think it'll be cool to see what they bring in and what we're able to get off of that. So it's a fun little project that we kind of have going. That's easy to.
First, I've heard of it. But
it's easy. That's easy to set up and forget about. Well, I started it at home, so.
Well, I think that's a really good point, Russ. And we haven't really touched on a lot, but we've been talking about cool ship and kind of like an open air type of inoculation. But finding wild microbes in places in nature where there is ready sources of sugars, carbohydrates, like the honey is great, and then something that sometimes people forget is that, winemaking is really easy to do and was traditionally done by just using the yeast that's on the skins. So when people often ask us, what's like the easy, how do I just pretty much guarantee, I don't have a Civil War era chest. How do I guarantee I can get a wild microbe? And usually I just say, find some ripe fruit and you're pretty much good to go. I mean, you can do the equivalent of a carbonic maceration with just any kind of wild fruit and just let it sit. And it's probably the simplest fermentation. It can ferment itself, or you could just drop that into something like beer wort and get lots of good microbes, whether it's grapes or raspberries or blueberries or that kind of thing. That's a really simple way to find some good yeast.
Yeah, it's actually a fun fact. Grape juice, I believe, didn't exist until the 1800s or something.
It's impossible.
The concept, there wasn't a thing because if you make grape juice, it becomes wine
making wine
quite quickly.
Oh, yeah.
And so until they had the technology to pasteurize it, which was probably some real puritanical thing, I'm sure. But it was there wasn't wine. Go back to the 1800s. You're like, hey, let's get some grape juice. And people are like, what? How would you do that? Unless you're a winemaker and you're on the day of crush or something. Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of definitely grapes ferment themselves really easily. So,
Jeff, you kind of brought up a point that there's another yeast provider that we've worked with out west, and they, talk about taking, or capturing yeast cultures or whatever on certain fruits, and then finding that those fruits or that yeast strain will then accentuate certain flavors in beers. Is that something that you think is accurate? Do you think, for instance, pull something off of a peach, you've kind of got a peach kind of forward beer. Do you think that yeast strain will accentuate those peach flavors better, or do you think that's kind of a stretch?
I can't speak for what they're saying. It's not something I've seen, and things we work with, and we've worked with a lot of microbes that are sourced from different substrates. In some ways, I'm kind of thankful because I found some amazing yeast cultures on some amazing things, and I'm kind of glad it doesn't accentuate the things that they were found on. So I can't personally back that up, but if you can, that would be absolutely amazing. I mean, I think to me the most important thing is kind of the story behind where it's sourced and found, and it's the human's job to really explain what we're drinking and enjoying. And so whether it's peach-esque, that entirely might be for one person or another person too. So that stuff is so subjective, and like James is talking about, the science of blending is pretty darn subjective. So your idea of what is good or what a flavor is like is hard to do even with something like an IPA, which a lot of people have similar descriptors that they use. But when you start going to a point where you're introducing several different yeast and bacteria species, we don't have enough words in the English language, maybe in other languages, to describe some of those beers, I think.
I lost you for a second there. I'm sorry, buddy.
That's okay. I wasn't saying anything important, though.
I heard the whole thing, so I don't know. It must have been us. Yeah.
It's my these headphones probably. So, Rachel.
Yes.
I don't know. We got 10 minutes left. I'm trying to figure out where to go from here. I think I've kind of touched on a lot. So
I have a question.
You go for it. Geek
okay,
out
cool.
And have fun.
How do you, James, handle like fruiting your wild beers? Do you fruit in the foeder? Do you fruit in a separate steel vessel? And then how long do you condition it on whole fruit, or whatever you guys do?
Yeah, so we do it, I don't know, probably every way you could imagine. We've done with grapes, we've done carbonic maceration first with just the fruit by. So we've done that with cherries too, but just a CO2 flushed vessel and let them get they start breaking down on their own essentially, and then add that to finished beer. When we use whole fruit, generally we wait for it to be really overripe. It depends on the fruit, what vessel we add it in. Generally stainless is easiest to get it out of, and we're almost always adding to finished beer. So the beer is already however old it is. A lot of our canned beers we use Oregon fruit products, puree, because we can get it year round, honestly, and people want pineapple beers in February and that sort of thing. It's a good product. That we do those in stainless. Those beers are all, for the most part, all done fully in stainless. Our Solera vessels are stainless, like that tank right there. We have many more of those offsite. So that we're on the fruit for about 3 weeks, usually, sometimes 4 weeks. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we do a creek style beer every year, and we get our cherries in late June or early July, whole cherries with the pits in them, and we add those to a foeder, which is actually one of the ones right behind me, and we fill it up with beer, and then it rests on those cherries until the next crop comes in. So like a couple weeks before we go to pick up the cherries, we rack that beer off, clean it out, and so it sits on the fruit for about a year, 10 months, cool. 11 months, depending on the harvest. We get those cherries from eastern Utah. So, so it's the whole spectrum there, basically.
That's awesome.
That is awesome. Rachel, I do want to talk a little bit about having the sour program, live sour program next to our clean program, and kind of the SOPs that's involved there. I know we've had a lot of brewers come in and look at us like we're crazy all the time. And Jeff and James, this might be something you guys can add to as well. Do you guys, Jeff, I know you're doing everything from one space, whether it be yeast, bacteria, and Do you guys ever have any problems with cross contamination, and or is it fairly simple to keep, as long as your SOPs are solid, to keep all that separate, or is that something you advise against as far as folks doing? And James, same question there.
I think it's totally doable. And I'd say, like you said exactly, we run several strains, the same lab. We're a little bit different. We have more specialized equipment. If you have a QC lab, you might have similar things like a hood or some kind of autoclave type situation. So we try to have the highest level of sanitation possible. But that being said, it's totally doable in a brewery. I think what I struggle with, and I think it's more just like a mentality thing, is SOPs are not a replacement for verification. Like, science is about process, but also verification. And so we have a really good process, and we still have issues sometimes, and that's why we literally verify every single thing multiple times before it goes out the door, because that's the only way you can actually be confident in your SOPs working, and they don't always work. I mean, every entity that works in some kind of product manufacturing has a quality process, and you have to reject things occasionally. And so as long as you go into it with that mindset, it's totally doable. And if you have a knowledge of working with basic agar media like WLN, you can pull off some pretty amazing things because you'd actually know what's in your beer. So it's totally doable.
Yeah, I honestly would say that verification is a must for the SOP itself. And so that's kind of how we do it. I know Rachel has quite a few tools at her disposal to kind of check and verify that we are in fact doing what we think we're doing, and that what's in the end product is actually there and not contaminated with something else. James, do you guys how do you guys, or I guess you said it earlier, wild doesn't mean sour, so what how do you keep that separate?
We do a small amount of pure culture stuff with wild strains. And honestly, like, it's something that sometimes I wish we had like a totally separate facility, but I think it would just be peace of mind. And to me, it doesn't matter too much, because even if you only make clean beers, you still have to do the same kind of cleaning and sanitation anyway. We just do it a little extra, and it's pretty easy for us to like really overkill on cleaning and sanitation when we're going to do a pure culture beer, because we don't do them very often. So it's like, to really make that cycle a little longer on the tank, or really like extra make sure whatever we're doing is I don't even know if it's necessary, because really if you're following a proper procedure, it doesn't matter that other things are in the building. So I don't know. Yeah. And I agree. Like, I mean, with a pretty simple lab setup, you can test for especially bacterial contamination really easily. And I don't see it as an issue, but I mean, you should be doing that if you're making only IPAs. Like, yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I don't think that people that only make clean beers are out there just being like, well, we only use lab yeast, so we're good. Like, those beers probably suck. So yeah. I mean, that can't be your attitude. If just because you don't make sour beer doesn't mean that there's no potential for contamination, right? I mean, look at all the many Goose Island recalling the whatever it's called stout in Bourbon County, right? I mean, I guess that makes sour beer too, so, but maybe that's why.
We've seen brewers that won't even allow a sour or a live sour beer or cultures to be in their brew house, period. And I've always kind of laughed at that when you look and their grain room is sitting right there next to everything else. And so because I who was it that is out of South Carolina that they just use the lacto off the back of the grain to ferment out their kettle sours. And so which I have never confirmed this, but I hear is one of the best places to find lacto if you're gonna find it is on the back of grain. And so we get a lot of flack here from some brewers that are clean breweries, and they come down here and see us with sour cultures all over the brew house, and whether it be putting something down the drain or right next to a clean tank or whatever. But it's an interesting take on it all to think that inside that environment that there's absolutely nothing going on. I've always been under the impression, at least, I couldn't say the understanding completely because I've never looked into it more, but there's probably more bacteria and wild stuff all over everything in that brew house than so I don't really see much of a difference, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, if your drain, things from your drain, whether it's sour beer or not, is getting into your fermentation tank, you have big problems. It doesn't matter what you're putting down. I mean, it's literally connected with just a U pipe to the sewer. Like, I mean, it should not. It doesn't matter what you're putting down there. Like, you mop the floors. That's dirtier than sour beer as far as fucking up your beer. I don't know. I mean, it's a wild argument, but I've heard a lot of crazy stuff like that. I mean, we don't really deal too much with it because we don't do it a lot, but I've heard people just make some crazy arguments. And it's like, if that's your problem, like, you're gonna have a problem making any kind of beer. So
I think you guys think about this more too, but like, I think it's sometimes just about the equipment you use and just trying to be deliberate about those things, because I think maybe the mentality is just that minute amounts of contamination might be inevitable, and you may not need to toss your entire batch of beer if you have 3 cells of English ale yeast in a clean beer. But if you have a few cells of lacto or bread or something, it might be a little more expressive. So I think in that situation, being deliberate about using separate equipment if it's possible might help. Some people have a bad day and they don't follow the correct SOP, and then there you go, you've lost a batch. I mean, that's just human nature. So I think things like that are things that you can control for, but otherwise, you're right. I mean, you can jump in a tank full of wort and start your next fermentation. So.
Ooh, sounds like a good project. Oh my gosh, Rachel, what are your thoughts on the SOP thing and having I kind of started to go to you and then I got sidetracked.
I mean, very similar to what James and Jeff said. We use separate tanks, obviously, separate soft parts. So we have whole different sets of hoses and gaskets and everything along those lines. And I mean, as good as your SOPs are, I think what Jeff said, it all comes down to the final product, because there's always user error, essentially. Like, we're humans and people make mistakes, or, something slips through the cracks. So we test for mostly HLP. I mean, between every transfer to every tank, and then if we do a fruit addition to a clean beer, we'll test on the HLP after that as well. But it's all about, having those strict SOPs and expecting people to follow them, but it's also, following up and just ensuring that they were met. So we do a lot of lab testing here, but we're also super fortunate. I'm not scared anymore. When I first started here, I was, but I was laughing because the funniest thing I've ever encountered, we had a bunch of brewers from our local area over, and there's not a lot of breweries around here that do live sour beer. So the head brewer at the time, like, a hose blew out from one of our sour tanks and like sprayed sour beer all over this clean tank. And all the brewers were sitting there and they're like, oh my God. And they were like, do we need hot water? Like, what do we need? And he just takes an ISO bottle and like a towel and it's just like spraying it down and ISOing it. And I mean, stuff happens, but I think as long as your SOPs are strict and you're following up with tests, I wouldn't worry too much about it. Knock on wood, I guess.
Right. Yeah. I mean, either way, when we first decided to do the live sour program, we all kind of looked at each other and the brewer at the time was like, well, I asked him, I said, what's the worst that can happen? And he was like, well, You know, we could sour everything. I said, so we're just an all sour brewery. And he was like, yeah. And I was like, I could deal with that. So, which nobody around here really drinks sour beer. We find a lot more appreciation outside of our home market. But it is what it is, man. We're doing what makes us happy and what we love to do. And it's a different side of brewing that a lot of folks don't mess with, but it's a more intricate and just difficult piece that a lot of people don't understand, which I think for me makes it more intriguing. And I know Rachel too, she, you know, geeks out over this stuff far more than I do, as I can see Jeff and James both do as well. So I was texting on here a second ago. I kind of hit my biology threshold an hour ago. So I've been out biology by everybody here. So, but it's been a very interesting and intriguing talk. And I think that, you know, it will be live on YouTube even after the fact for folks to view. So, you know, if you're looking for some just advice and ways to kind of step up your game, whether it's at home or even in the brewery, there's a wealth of information on here so far. But we are going to call it at this point, but I want to go through and give you guys one last chance to have a final say. If there's anything that I missed that you just think needs to get out there, that folks need to hear, I'd say have at it. Let's start with you, Jeff.
I mean, I think the only thing is don't let the concept of implementing any kind of scientific concept in your brewing or anything else you're doing be daunting. I mean, all this is like really easy to achieve. And like Russ was saying, the information is kind of out there. You can go to our website, bootlegbiology.com, or tons of resources, books, websites, videos. It's not impossible. And if you can brew beer, you can do a ton of these things. And I think the only other thought is that, you know, I think Ouzel Finch, Black Project, a lot of really well-known breweries, they didn't necessarily make and get a reputation for making good beer just based on scientific process. You know, I think it's a lot of really talented people just learning their craft. And I think the best way, and I'll let you guys talk about that too, but the best way is just by doing it, right? And so experiment as much as possible, and you'll learn by doing. And I think that's how some of the best beer is made.
Agreed, 100%. James, what about you, sir?
Yeah, I would say, I guess just to piggyback off that, I think that's excellent advice. I think I would just say, like, do your own thing and don't get tied up in what people tell you to do. Yeah, I think there are people in the brewing community that are very scientifically based, and they'll tell you you can't do clean beers and sour beers in the same facility. And there's people who will tell you, well, you could just, instead of doing beer that way, you could just do it this way, and this is scientifically going to be the same. But if you don't believe that, or you don't want to do it that way, then don't do it that way. And especially as you become a professional in this, there's an old saying that says, the dog barks, but the caravan rolls on, which is basically like, just do your fucking thing and like ignore the people who are like, you know, insignificant that want to tell you what you're doing. It's true if you're a home brewer too, right? I mean, I've been at homebrew club meetings where people are just shitting on people for like their ideas. I'm like, why have you done that? You haven't done that. Nobody's done that. That probably sounds like it'll be gross, but you don't have to like tell them not to do it. If it's what they want to do, then, you know, whatever it is. Like, I mean, somebody was the first person to make a stout with fucking cupcakes and graham crackers and mac and cheese in it, you know? And that sounds awful, but people were doing really well with that. And I'm not going to, like, I don't know. Some of them are pretty good. So I guess my point is, like, you could be at home or professionally making the next thing with your weird ass idea that somebody on Reddit or somebody on some Facebook group wants to tell you is stupid and you'd be better to do it this way. It's like, listen, man, you can do it that way if you want to, but I'm going to do it the way that I want. And if it sucks, then I'm the one who paid for all of it. So what do you care? You know?
Exactly.
So, yeah.
And you've got when you've got 100 people moving one direction and one person, you know, if it works out, you stand out. And that's
true. It's true.
I think
yeah.
That's what makes it a little more unique and awesome.
Yeah.
What about you, Ray?
I think they said it all, honestly. I mean, specifically with our brewery, we've had those people that say we're crazy, and we do weird stuff. And I think as much science as there is in what we just talked about, it's a lot of art and just being passionate about it and kind of going with the flow, because at the end, like, the microbes have a mind of their own, and you can control as much as you can, but I think Jeff said it, they kind of control you. So just have fun with it, and don't be afraid to step outside of the BJCP style guidelines and create something that's more art than it is a list of stuff.
I think that is one of my favorite things about beer. And, you know, in the small chance that I use my social media, I usually will put in there beer is art. And I think that's key, man, is it really is expressing who we are and what we're about through this art form. You know, as I've learned through this Friends with Benefits Fest that we're putting on, there are many other forms of art that are out there, and makers that are just as passionate about their craft as we are. You know, we have a video segment today about knife making, which we went and did with a Forged and Fire judge, and he was every bit as passionate about his knife making as we were our beer. And then we had Pretentious Glass Co. We went out and did some stuff with them, and we have them on later as well. And so, but it's you know, just being passionate about your art form and loving what you do. Nobody wants to, you know, come to work every day and hate life, but being able to express who you are through that art, I think is amazing. And I think, Jeff, you approach it from that you know, yeast and bacteria type level. I don't even know what you would call it, but you approach it as an art form as well, which I think is what has made you successful. And you know, I appreciate that. But do you is yeast banking the next craft brew phase, where are we going to have yeast banks pop up all over the place?
Man, if I'm ever going to retire early, I really will. No, I mean, I think everyone could have a bank in their brewery or home, and I think that's something that's totally doable. And to me, citizen science is really about empowerment with knowledge and capability. And if you want to learn, you can do it. And yeah, you might make the next best beer or whatever. And the only way you're going to find out is if you try.
Oh yeah. Awesome. Well, I really appreciate it. You guys have been amazing. Jeff, thank you so much. We'll be definitely talking with you soon. James, collab on the horizon, hopefully.
Absolutely.
We'll talk soon. We'll throw some stuff in Wood. I know we've texted a little bit about it, but we'll get Rachel on there and throw some stuff in Wood at both locations if you're up for it. And then Ray, you're awesome. And as always, killing it nonstop. So I appreciate y'all coming on and spreading some knowledge and helping really just school some folks on sours and bacteria and yeast strains. So
thanks for having me. I appreciate
Thanks
it.
for having me.
All right.
See you later.
We'll talk to you soon, guys. Bye.